The year was 1941, and the world held its breath. Across the globe, conflict was spreading like an unstoppable fire. In Europe, the forces of Nazi Germany marched across the continent, while Great Britain stood nearly alone, a bastion of defiance against a seemingly endless tide. Far across the Pacific Ocean, another empire had its own grand ambitions. The Empire of Japan, a nation with a powerful military and a deep sense of destiny, was expanding its reach across Asia. It had already invaded Manchuria and was locked in a brutal, protracted war with China, seeking resources and dominance over its neighbors. This aggression had not gone unnoticed by the United States. Washington watched Japan's expansion with growing alarm. The American government, though officially neutral, saw the conflict as a threat to peace and stability in the Pacific. In response, President Franklin D. Roosevelt took a stand. He enacted a series of economic sanctions, cutting off Japan's access to vital resources like scrap metal and, most crucially, oil. For Japan, a nation with few natural resources of its own, this was more than a political maneuver. It was an act of economic strangulation. The embargo threatened to grind its military machine to a halt. The diplomatic channels between Tokyo and Washington grew icy, and the language became harder. As the autumn of 1941 turned toward winter, tensions reached a breaking point. Japan's leaders felt they were backed into a corner, faced with a choice: either abandon their imperial ambitions or go to war with the United States to secure the resources they needed. They chose war. In the utmost secrecy, a powerful naval task force, centered around 6 aircraft carriers, slipped out of its home waters and began a long, silent journey across the vast and empty expanse of the North Pacific. Its destination was a place of profound strategic importance, a place where the heart of America's Pacific Fleet lay at anchor Pearl Harbor, in the Hawaiian Islands. The American naval base was a picture of tranquility, a tropical paradise that seemed a world away from the conflicts raging elsewhere. Sailors and soldiers stationed there went about their daily routines, enjoying the warm sun and the peaceful rhythm of island life. They felt secure, protected by the immense power of the fleet and the thousands of miles of ocean that separated them from any potential foe. But that feeling of safety was a fragile illusion. An attack was not considered impossible, but it was deemed highly improbable. The prevailing belief was that any trouble would come from sabotage, not from a full-scale aerial assault. This fatal assumption set the stage for the catastrophe to come. December 7, 1941, dawned as just another beautiful Sunday in paradise. The Hawaiian sun cast a warm, golden light across the calm waters of Pearl Harbor. For the thousands of American sailors aboard the ships of the Pacific Fleet, it was a morning of rest. Many were still asleep in their bunks, while others were preparing for church services or planning a day of leisure ashore in Honolulu. The battleships, the pride of the fleet, were moored neatly in pairs along Ford Island, a stretch of water that would soon be known to history as Battleship Row. The scene was one of overwhelming peace, a powerful military force at complete and total rest, unaware of the doom that was screaming toward them from the sky. At precisely 7:55 a.m., that peace was irrevocably shattered. The drone of engines filled the air, a sound that at first seemed familiar, like routine training flights. But then came the explosions. The first wave of 183 Japanese aircraft, launched from carriers hundreds of miles away, descended upon the harbor with terrifying precision, led by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who famously radioed the coded message, "Tora, Tora, Tora," signaling that complete surprise had been achieved. The attackers struck with brutal efficiency. Torpedo planes flew low and fast, dropping their deadly payloads into the water, while dive bombers plunged from the heavens, their sirens wailing like banshees. The initial moments were a whirlwind of disbelief and chaos. Men who had been peacefully sipping coffee one second were thrown across decks the next. The air was suddenly filled with the thunder of explosions, the shriek of twisting metal, and the acrid smell of smoke and burning oil. Anti-aircraft guns, many of them unmanned and with their ammunition locked away, began to sputter to life as frantic sailors scrambled to their battle stations. But it was too little, too late. The Japanese pilots faced minimal resistance as they made their deadly runs, turning the serene harbor into a fiery cauldron of destruction in a matter of minutes. The surprise was absolute. On the airfields surrounding the harbor, American planes were parked wingtip to wingtip, a measure taken to prevent sabotage, but one that made them perfect targets for strafing and bombing. They were destroyed on the ground before they ever had a chance to get airborne. The attack was not just on the ships, but on the very capacity of the base to fight back. Before most Americans had even realized what was happening, the first wave of attackers had crippled the mighty Pacific Fleet, leaving a trail of fire, smoke, and death in its wake. The day of infamy had begun. Amid the thunderous chaos and spreading devastation, the light cruiser USS St. Louis was moored at a pier in the southeast lock of Pearl Harbor, tied up next to its sister ship, the USS Honolulu. For the crew of the St. Louis, that Sunday morning was supposed to be one of routine maintenance. The ship was not in a state of readiness for combat. Its boilers were cold, meaning it had no steam to generate power or turn its propellers. Scaffolding still clung to its superstructure from the recent installation of new radar equipment. A heavy steel gangway, a temporary bridge for shoreside power cables and water lines, had been welded to the pier, physically tethering the ship to the land. It was, for all intents and purposes, a sitting duck. When the first bombs began to fall, confusion quickly gave way to a surge of adrenaline and disciplined action. On the deck of the St. Louis, sailors saw the unmistakable red circles on the wings of the attacking planes and knew instantly that this was no drill. The ship's klaxons blared the call to general quarters, and men poured from their bunks and mess halls, racing to their battle stations. Under the decisive leadership of their captain, George A. Rood, the crew began to fight back with everything they had. Without power from the main engines, gunners operated the anti-aircraft batteries on auxiliary power, their barrels spitting fire at the enemy planes swarming overhead. The first and most critical task was to get the ship moving. While gun crews laid down a barrage of defensive fire, the engineering crew below decks engaged in a frantic race against time. They had to light the ship's massive boilers and build up enough steam pressure to power the engines. This was a process that normally took hours, but the black gang in the engine room knew they only had minutes. They worked with a desperate urgency in the sweltering heat, coaxing the cold machinery to life while the ship shuddered from the concussions of nearby explosions. Their lives and the life of their ship depended on their speed and skill. Meanwhile, on deck, another problem had to be solved. The St. Louis was physically stuck. The power cables and water hoses connecting it to the pier were quickly cast off, but the heavy steel gangway remained, welded firmly in place. There was no time to find welders to cut it loose properly. Thinking fast, a group of sailors grabbed sledgehammers and began to pound away at the welded joints with furious energy. With every swing, they fought for their freedom, their blows ringing out against the steel in a frantic rhythm of survival. Slowly, miraculously, the welds began to give way, and the gangway was finally broken free, severing the ship's last tie to the shore. At 9:31 a.m., less than an hour and a half after the attack began, a plume of black smoke billowed from the funnels of the USS St. Louis. Down in the engine room, the heroic efforts of the engineering crew had paid off. They had raised enough steam to get underway. Captain Rood gave the order, and the ship's powerful engines rumbled to life. The St. Louis began to back slowly away from its berth, becoming one of the first major warships to move under its own power that morning. As it pulled into the channel, its gunners continued to fire at the second wave of Japanese planes, claiming credit for shooting down at least 3 enemy aircraft during its departure. The journey out of the harbor was a perilous obstacle course. The narrow channel was choked with smoke, debris, and the burning, sinking hulks of other ships. The St. Louis had to navigate a treacherous path through the maelstrom. It carefully maneuvered around the capsized USS Oklahoma and the listing USS California, their stricken forms a grim testament to the attack's fury. As it gained speed, the ship passed the heavily damaged USS Nevada, which had also attempted to escape but was now beached to avoid blocking the channel. The crew of the St. Louis watched in horror as they passed the inferno that was once the USS Arizona, its fires raging uncontrollably. As the St. Louis neared the harbor entrance, it faced one final deadly threat: A Japanese midget submarine, one of 5 that had been deployed to infiltrate the harbor, had slipped past the outer defenses. It spotted the escaping cruiser and fired 2 of its torpedoes. A lookout aboard the St. Louis screamed a warning, and the ship's helm was put over hard. But there was little room to maneuver. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed the ship's daring escape would end in disaster just yards from the open sea. Then, in a stroke of incredible fortune, both torpedoes struck a coral reef just short of the ship's hull and exploded harmlessly. Having cheated death one last time, the USS St. Louis charged toward the anti-submarine nets that blocked the harbor entrance. Without waiting for them to be fully open, the cruiser smashed through them, its momentum carrying it into the clear, deep waters of the Pacific Ocean. By mid-morning, it was free. Steaming at 22 knots, the USS St. Louis became one of the only major warships to escape the inferno of Pearl Harbor during the attack. It had done so without suffering a single casualty, and with only minor damage from bomb shrapnel. The crew's quick thinking, discipline, and courage had turned an impossible situation into one of the day's few triumphs. While the St. Louis made its miraculous escape, the scene it left behind was one of unimaginable destruction, particularly along Battleship Row. Here, the core of American naval power in the Pacific was systematically annihilated. The USS Arizona became the most tragic symbol of the day. Just after 8 o'clock in the morning, a 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb, dropped from a high-altitude bomber, struck the battleship near its forward turrets. It penetrated deep into the ship and detonated the forward powder magazine. The resulting explosion was cataclysmic, a fireball that lifted the 33,000-ton vessel out of the water before breaking its back. The Arizona sank in minutes, taking 1,177 of its crew with it to a watery grave. Moored just behind the Arizona was the USS Oklahoma. It was struck by as many as 9 torpedoes in rapid succession, all hitting its port side. The massive battleship, top-heavy and vulnerable, began to list severely. Within 12 minutes of the first hit, it had rolled completely over, its masts digging into the muddy harbor floor. Hundreds of men were trapped inside its dark, overturned hull. For days afterward, rescuers would hear faint tapping from within as they raced to cut through the thick steel to save those they could. In the end, 429 sailors and Marines lost their lives aboard the Oklahoma, many of whom could not be reached in time. Other giants of the fleet met similar fates. The USS California and the USS West Virginia were both hit by multiple torpedoes and bombs and slowly sank into the shallow waters of the harbor, settling upright on the bottom. The crew of the West Virginia fought valiantly, with their captain, Mervyn Bennion, mortally wounded but refusing to leave his post on the bridge. The USS Nevada, moored alone at the end of Battleship Row, became the only battleship to get underway during the attack. As it steamed toward the harbor entrance, it became a primary target for the second wave of Japanese bombers, which hoped to sink it in the narrow channel and block the harbor completely. Severely damaged and on fire, the Nevada was deliberately run aground to avoid this fate, its heroic but doomed effort a sight that inspired men all over the harbor. Elsewhere, the destruction was just as severe. The destroyer USS Shaw, sitting in a floating dry dock, was hit by bombs that ignited its forward magazine. It exploded in a spectacular and terrifying fireball that was captured in one of the most famous photographs of the attack. By the time the skies fell silent, 18 American ships had been sunk or were heavily damaged. The heart of the Pacific Fleet had been torn out, and Pearl Harbor had become a graveyard of twisted steel and shattered pride. The devastating success of the Japanese attack was not only a result of meticulous planning and flawless execution, it was also a consequence of a series of missed signals, ignored warnings, and tragic misinterpretations on the American side. In the weeks and months leading up to December 7th, the diplomatic air was thick with tension, and Washington knew that war with Japan was not just possible, but likely. On November 27, 1941, the War Department sent out a war warning to all major commanders in the Pacific, including those in Hawaii. The message was stark, stating that negotiations with Japan had broken down and that hostile action was possible at any moment. However, the warning was fatally ambiguous. It did not specify where an attack might occur, and it advised commanders to undertake reconnaissance and other measures without alarming the civil population. In Pearl Harbor, the local commanders, Admiral Husband E. Kimmel and Lieutenant General Walter C. Short, interpreted this warning through the lens of their own preconceived notions. They believed the greatest threat to the base was not a full-scale air raid, but acts of sabotage committed by local Japanese sympathizers. This led to a crucial error. To guard the aircraft more easily, they ordered them parked in tight clusters on the airfields, wingtip to wingtip, making them perfect targets for an aerial assault. The final hours before the attack were filled with even more direct yet unheeded warnings. At 6:45 a.m., nearly an hour before the first bombs fell, the destroyer USS Ward was on patrol outside the harbor entrance when it spotted and sank a Japanese midget submarine attempting to sneak into the naval base. The Ward immediately sent a coded message back to headquarters reporting the action. This was the first shot of the Pacific War, an unambiguous act of aggression. But due to a series of delays and a desire for verification, the report did not reach senior commanders in time to sound a general alarm. Just moments later, at 7:02 a.m., 2 Army privates at a remote radar station on the northern tip of Oahu saw something astonishing on their screen. A massive formation of aircraft, larger than anything they had ever seen, approaching the island from the north. They immediately called their superior officer to report the sighting. Tragically, the officer on duty dismissed their report. He assumed the radar blips were a flight of American B-17 bombers that were expected to arrive from the mainland that morning. He told the young operators, "Don't worry about it." These final, crucial pieces of the puzzle were cast aside, and the path was cleared for the Japanese planes to arrive completely unopposed. After the second wave of Japanese aircraft returned to their carriers around 10 o'clock in the morning, the pilots and their commanders were, honestly, jubilant. They had achieved a stunning victory, exceeding even their most optimistic expectations. The American battleships were burning and sunk. The airfields were in ruins, and the U.S. Pacific Fleet was, for all practical purposes, crippled. Aboard his flagship, the Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the commander of the Japanese strike force, received the triumphant reports. His flight leaders, flushed with success, urged him to launch a third wave. They argued that there were still critical targets left untouched, and that another strike could deliver the final, decisive blow. The targets they had in mind were not ships, but the shore-based infrastructure that supported the entire fleet. The massive oil storage tanks, holding millions of barrels of fuel, were still standing, completely exposed and vulnerable. The naval repair yards, the submarine pens, and the power station were also largely intact. Destroying these facilities would have been a far greater strategic disaster for the United States than the loss of the aging battleships. Without fuel and repair capabilities, Pearl Harbor would have been rendered useless as a forward base, forcing the U.S. Navy to operate from ports on the West Coast, thousands of miles away. It would have set back the American war effort by a year or more. Despite the pleas from his subordinates, Admiral Nagumo made a fateful decision. He chose caution over aggression. He was concerned about the losses his force had already sustained. 29 aircraft had been shot down, and more were damaged. He was also worried about the dwindling fuel supply on his destroyers, and the fact that the location of the American aircraft carriers was still unknown. He feared that if he lingered, he might be caught in a counterattack from the very carriers he had failed to find. His primary mission had been to neutralize the battleships, and in that, he had succeeded spectacularly. He saw no reason to risk his precious carriers for secondary objectives, and so Nagumo gave the order to withdraw. The Japanese fleet turned for home, leaving the job half-finished. This decision would later be seen by many historians, both American and Japanese, as a colossal strategic blunder. While the destruction of the battleships was a shocking blow to American morale, their loss was not as critical as it seemed. The age of the battleship was already passing, and the war in the Pacific would be decided by aircraft carriers. By leaving Pearl Harbor's infrastructure intact, Nagumo had left the United States with the very means to repair, refuel, and rearm its surviving fleet, and to begin the long, hard fight back. In the dark and dispiriting hours that followed the attack, as smoke billowed over Oahu and the nation reeled in shock, stories of heroism and survival began to emerge from the chaos. Few were as dramatic or as inspiring as the tale of the USS St. Louis. The news that a major warship had not only fought back but had successfully run the gauntlet of fire and steel to reach the open sea spread quickly. In a day defined by devastating loss and unpreparedness, the story of the St. Louis was a desperately needed glimmer of light. It was a testament to the fact that even in the face of overwhelming surprise, American courage and ingenuity had not been extinguished. The ship and its crew instantly became legendary. The St. Louis was given a new nickname, one that would follow it throughout the war: Lucky Lou. The name was a nod to its incredible fortune in avoiding the torpedoes from the midget submarine, but it was also a profound understatement. The ship's survival was not just a matter of luck. It was earned through the quick thinking of Captain Rood, the tireless work of its engineers, and the disciplined courage of every sailor who manned a gun or hauled on a line. They had refused to be victims. They had fought, and they had won their freedom from the trap. The escape of the St. Louis served as a powerful symbol for a nation suddenly thrust into war. It demonstrated that the U.S. Navy was not entirely broken, that its spirit remained defiant. The image of the cruiser steaming out of the harbor, guns blazing, became a potent piece of propaganda and a source of genuine pride. It showed the American people and the world that the fight was far from over. In fact, it had just begun. The St. Louis immediately went on the offensive, joining the task force sent to hunt for the Japanese fleet, though the enemy was already too far away to be found. For the rest of World War II, Lucky Lou would live up to its name and its fighting reputation. The ship served with distinction across the Pacific, participating in numerous campaigns from the Aleutian Islands to the Solomon Islands and the Philippines. It earned 11 battle stars for its service, surviving kamikaze attacks and fierce naval engagements. Its story, born in the fires of December 7th, became a part of naval lore, a reminder that even on the darkest of days, there are always those who rise to the occasion, who refuse to surrender, and who, through their actions, write a chapter of heroism for the ages. The daring escape of the USS St. Louis from Pearl Harbor is more than just a dramatic sea story. It is a vital part of the larger narrative of that infamous day. It stands as a powerful counterpoint to the themes of failure and unpreparedness that so often dominate the historical account. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a moment of profound national trauma, a wound to the American psyche that galvanized a generation. It was a lesson, paid for in blood, about the dangers of complacency. The wreckage of the Arizona, still weeping oil into the harbor today, serves as a permanent, solemn memorial to those who were lost and the price of being caught unaware. Yet, within that tragedy, the actions of the crew of the St. Louis represent an enduring legacy of resilience. Their story reminds us that history is not just made by grand strategies and political decisions, but by the actions of ordinary individuals in extraordinary moments. The sailors who frantically worked to raise steam, the men who hammered away at a welded gangway, and the gunners who fired back at an overwhelming force all demonstrated a fundamental truth about the American spirit: a refusal to quit in the face of adversity. Their success was a victory of human will and professionalism over chaos and despair. This legacy of defiance became a cornerstone of America's response to the attack. The surprise strike was intended to break American morale and force the United States to accept Japanese dominance in the Pacific. Instead, it did the exact opposite. It united a divided country with a singular purpose. The rallying cry, "Remember Pearl Harbor," was not just a call for vengeance. It was a call to embody the same spirit of resilience shown by the crew of Lucky Lou. It was a promise that America would not only recover, but would rise stronger, more determined, and utterly committed to victory. Today, more than 80 years after that fateful Sunday morning, the story of the USS St. Louis continues to inspire. It teaches us that even when systems fail and warnings are missed, the courage and resourcefulness of individuals can make a profound difference. It is a testament to the idea that true strength is not the absence of vulnerability, but how one responds when that vulnerability is exposed. The ship that broke free from the fiery harbor on December 7, 1941, remains a timeless symbol of hope, a reminder that even in our darkest hour, the human spirit can and will fight its way toward the light.